In this video, we'll look at renting versus buying. In my life, I've met a variety of people who have very strong opinions about one or the other. It turns out it's actually quite complicated, both from a personal point of view and from a financial point of view. So I'm going to try and give you as much information as I can and let you make a decision on what you think's the best. And that'll change at different times of your life. Renting might be better at some point, buying might be better at another. Nonetheless, let's get to it. What are the advantages to renting? Well, first of all, with renting, not always, but almost always, it's usually cheaper. Just your rent's going to be cheaper than your mortgage payments, almost always. When you rent, it's also much easier to move. It's easy to just pack up and go. Sometimes there are rules, especially if it's your first year renting, but after that first year, it's very easy to end your renting. There's also an advantage of, right now, mortgage rules in Canada, you need a down payment to buy. With renting, there's no down payment. Sometimes they ask you for first and last month's rent, but that's a lot smaller than tens of thousands of dollars for a down payment. Another advantage of renting is there's no maintenance and repairs. If you break something, obviously you have to repair that, but when the appliances which belong to the landlord, and when the walls and when the roof have problems, that's on someone else to fix. That's an advantage for sure. There's also government protections. Government protections. You're protected under a number of laws, including like rent control. So there's limits to how much they can raise your rent. Each year there's a percentage, and that changes from year to year. Not every year does it change, but it's complicated. But generally you're protected. You also have no mortgage. So that's, a huge responsibility of years and years of paying off for your life. And finally, there's less responsibility. That kind of goes with the no repairs. But owning a house, there's a lot more responsibility, or owning a property. Less responsibility when you're renting. So what are the disadvantages of renting? Well, first of all, there can often be some rules and regulations, some of which protect you, but some of which you have to follow, and you might not like them, or you might not know them and get in trouble. So you have to follow, and on top of that, you have to follow sometimes what the landlord says. There are some things they can't make you do, but there's some things they can say, this is the rule, and you have to follow it. Whereas, obviously, in your own home, you make the rules. There's also this thing with renting, you're not building equity. Equity, in simple terms, is how much you have in assets minus how much you owe. And it's like your personal worth. And that's a good thing, is that you're building up amounting financial worth. If you're renting, all that money is just going to a landlord. It's not going into your house and later money that you'll have in the value of that house. When you're renting, there's a limit to personalization. When you own a home, you can knock walls down and change the colors. You can sometimes paint your rental apartment, but you have to ask the landlord. As long as you're not breaking the law with a house, you can pretty much do whatever you want. With a renting, it can be very strict what you can and can't do. Also, sometimes the landlord can come in. Usually, they have to ask your permission, and they need to give you 24 hours notice. But generally speaking, the landlord's allowed to come in if they give you notice. And so, with your house, you have to give permission, whereas the landlord can just say, I'm coming, and just give you notice, and then you have to let them in. Sometimes, hopefully you're living in a good place, but with rentings, sometimes it takes a long time for repairs. That might not be the landlord's fault. It might just be the case that money's tight, or they can't find someone to do it. But when it's you can put as much effort into repairing as you want. I've had friends who had to wait months for the laundry to be repaired. So that can be really sucky. And with renting, you're usually in an apartment, and they usually don't spend as much money on soundproofing, so you're more likely to have noisy neighbors. It's not necessarily true, but it's more likely. Those are your advantages and disadvantages for renting. So why buy? Well, the number one advantage for buying is you're building that equity we talked about. That equity is like personal worth. It's the value of your home minus what you still owe on it. It's like an investment. Generally speaking, homes go up. I mean, historically in Canada, for decades, properties have been going up steeply in value. So you're building value in the property. Later you sell it, you've made money. That's your equity in the house. That's a huge advantage to buying a house. And as we were saying with renting that you couldn't do, with a home you can modify almost anything. There's limits to, you can't violate. There's some fire codes, but generally speaking, you can do whatever you want with your house. It's also much easier to rent to others. There's a lot less rules to go through, and you own the house. You don't have to worry about when you're renting. There's rules about renting when you're already renting that gets much more complicated than if you're just renting the house. There's also a pride and status to owning your home. People are proud to own their home. It's yours. You own it. You have it. And people look at, for better or for worse, people own their property as prestigious. And the last thing is, similar to this equity thing, you can use your equity for other financial items. So for example, getting a loan or getting better rates. If you own a home, you'll stand to with financial institutions like banks and credit unions. They'll give you better rates if you own your home, because if you screw up your loan, and they can come take your house. So you're more protected they're more protected for their investment, and you get better, lower interest rates if you apply for a line of credit. If you apply for credit cards and you have a home, you're going to get better deals. But there are also big disadvantages to buying a home. The most problematic thing is it's expensive, especially at the start. So for example, you got to pay a bunch of fees. That includes, on top of, there's a lawyer and there's other fees. There's also often a real estate agent. And then what else do you need? You need to get an appraisal. There's a title. You got to pay for like the deed to your house. There's land transfer tax. I'm not going to list them all. I just wrote down a few of them, so I'd remember. I'm just looking at my little list here. So there's a whole bunch of fees, including real estate agent and a lawyer. You have to pay for an appraisal, title, land transfer. Oh, and the last thing is you have to pay HST, which is 13% of hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's a lot of extra. You don't have to pay HST on your rent. Now, with your HST, you can get a rebate from part of it from the government. You should look that up if you're buying a home. But generally speaking, it's way more expensive at the start to buy a house. But also, it's way more expensive per month, usually. Sometimes you can get really expensive rentals or really cheap house, but generally it's more expensive per month for a house, and that's because you have property taxes. You don't have to pay property taxes if you rent, but usually in Guelph it's like 1.25, I think, or 1.33. I'm trying to remember, but that's 1% of the value of your home. That's still 1% of hundreds of thousands of dollars is still going to be, $1,000, $2,000 a year, $3,000 a year. That's a lot of money. But also you're going to pay more because you have to do repairs. You're going to have higher insurance because you own the home. There's going to be more to insure, so the insurance companies inevitably will charge you more. And generally speaking, again, not always, but almost always, it's going to be higher payments on your mortgage than it would be to rent. There's also much more responsibility when you own. Responsibility. You have to do things like clear your driveway, and you have to care for your lawn, and like if you don't mow it, the neighbors can call and say you're affecting the neighborhood. You have to take care of the sidewalk in front of your house. There's a whole bunch of things with being a homeowner that are now your responsibility, including repairs. And finally, it's harder and usually more expensive to move. You can't just up and leave by giving 60 days notice. When you own a home, you've got to sell it, and that can be complicated and time-consuming and expensive. So those are the advantages and disadvantages both to renting and to buying.